So good afternoon to everyone here in the room, and good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everyone online, wherever you're joining us from. Welcome back to the third seminar in our joint series together with the Human Development Report Office at the United Nations Development Program, with IIEP at George University and with OPHI at the University of Oxford. In this seminar series, viewing multidimensional poverty from many angles, what the three co-hosting institutions are doing, we invite speakers to provide us further insights and innovations in multidimensional poverty measurement, analysis, and applications, both from an academic point of view, but also with a strong emphasis on the work of governments and national organizations and the applications of multidimensional poverty measures as policy tools. And today we have a presentation by two of our very own colleagues here at OPHI, Dr. Nicolai Suppa and Dr. Ricardo Nogales, who are joining us remotely because they're based in Barcelona and in Bolivia, respectively. And for those who attended last week's presentations, you will remember that a big chunk of the global MPI report released together by OPHI and UNDP this year focused on interlinkages and bundles of deprivations. And so what Ricardo and Nicolai are going to do and are going to present to us today is a paper that they've been working on jointly with OPHI Director Sabine Alkaya, which zooms in to these deprivation bundles and provides further insights on the many forms of poverty, analysis of deprivation interlinkages in the developing world. Before I'll allow Nicolai and Ricardo to take over the screen and Mike, please be aware that we are recording this session, so anything any of you will say here in the room will be on record, and also for those online, perhaps asking questions later, that might also be recorded, so please just be aware of that. We'll have a presentation for about 40 minutes from Nicolai and Ricardo, and then time to take questions both from the online audience. Feel free to pop your questions into the chat or the Q&A box if you're joining on Zoom, and of course from people joining us here physically in the seminar room in Oxford. So yeah, with that and without any further ado, over to you, Nicolai and Ricardo.
Hi. Yeah, first, thanks for the opportunity to present our joint work here. This is work together with Sabine and Ricardo, and it's the background paper of the latest joint report. You can also find an online copy of that. Unfortunately, there is a typo in the link, so it's actually 63A, where you can find the full paper, and you can find also all the figures and all the tables and additional material in those slides. Okay, so then let me start with the many forms of poverty and the analysis of deprivation interlinkages. Sorry, so now. So the motivation is, I think, straightforward. So on the one hand, we see, I mean, the Sustainable Development Goals have been adopted in 2015, and that was a huge achievement, for at least for two reasons. One is in terms of the consensus that is kind of documented in this agreement, but also that agreement so the underlying values in that consensus, but also that it indicates the broad way forward. What are the indicators to improve? And for many indicators, we already over the last decade we know that there was good and reasonable improvements. And for some indicators, it was expected to continue. The problem is, of course, the recent COVID pandemic is likely to yield or result in substantial setbacks. The larger point here is, however, that indicator by indicator analysis has its limitations, and this is actually also incorporated in the Sustainable Development Agenda, because it's called their SDG interactions, or they receive already attention, and multi-sectoral and coordinated policies as well. So there have been several publications on proposing specific frameworks, how to study interlinkages in the general SDG context. Now, moving ahead in terms of how does that look like in multidimensional poverty? Actually, interlinkages figure quite prominently in some sense in our everyday work, because the entire endeavor of measuring multidimensional poverty is, or the idea is to capture the different deprivations in different domains of life in the first place, and use the overlap or the simultaneity directly in the identification step of poverty measurement. So we are interested in measuring poverty as multiple deprivation. And that's pretty much from the outset, or that's very much the spirit of multidimensional poverty measurement. Amartya Sen has for long been arguing that we need a comprehensive framework to incorporate all those deprivations. And there have been various scholars arguing that the very interlinkage, the overlap of deprivation, is key in the analysis. Here we have a quote of Angus Deaton commenting on a global MPI release: a world in which the people who lack education have the same ability to participate in civil affairs would be, in many respects, a much better world than the one which we live in. And a dashboard cannot tell us in which world we are in. So in this sense, interlinkages figure prominently in our work. However, if we look a little bit more into the details, how deprivation interlink, not much is known, neither in terms of multidimensional poverty, and even less so in terms of the SDGs. And for the SDGs, one problem is we need comparable data, we need a uniform framework, and this is this is the gap we're trying to address in this work. So to document interlinkages around the world. Now, more specifically, what we are doing in this paper, we have different components. One is a methodological contribution, where we propose how to complement conventional analysis that we usually do or apply in our day-to-day work with specific forms of deprivation profile analysis. Mostly we focus on the prevalence of deprivation profiles. We also will look into deprivation bundles. We look into co-deprivation of bundles, but also we could generalize that concept actually. And we will also explore the use of latent classes. Data-wise, we use the global MPI data of the latest release, which covers 111 countries and represents more than 6 billion people. And the data is documented, that we're using is documented in the methodological note. But then we have an extensive empirical analysis, but that can only be like scratching the surface. I will later explain why and how we do that. And on the discussion side, we also want to explain that this is actually a framework that we propose, how deprivation overlap or interlinkage can be studied. And that can be adapted to different settings. It could be national context or world region context and other settings. But there is also a little bit on policy relevance, which we want to touch upon in the discussion. Now, the outline is straightforward. First, I will briefly recap how we measure global multidimensional poverty, and then I will go into the methods, the results, and the discussion. So how do we measure global multidimensional poverty? Well, we use the global MPI. I will be very brief on this. We have 10 indicators, which are informed by MDGs in the past, and recently the revision aligns these indicators better with the SDGs. This includes, for instance, deprivation in nutrition or child mortality. We have 3 dimensions. Each dimension is weighted equally, and within each dimension, we also apply equal weights to each indicator. The global MPI adopts the dual cutoff counting approach. So besides the deprivation cutoff, we also have a cross-dimensional poverty cutoff, which requires a household to experience at least a third of the maximum possible deprivations. Again, this data is documented in the methodological note. We use different surveys. They're mostly DHS, Mix, and PATFUN, but we also have occasional national surveys. So now let me explain the framework that we adopt for interlinkage analysis. To simplify things, we will focus on 3 deprivation indicators, and we have here the population represented by the rectangle, and we have 3 circles representing the set of the people deprived in indicator 1, 2, and 3. The reason is, with 10 indicators, things get very quickly complicated and are hard to visualize. A kind of downside of this approach is it's very instructive, but the problem is that we have a couple of special cases, so we have to be careful with generalization of certain observations. Now, let's consider also a simplified MPI. Let's say we require more than 1 deprivation for poverty, so we have a second cutoff, right? So what we then actually are interested in are these gray intersections, these subsets. They are of particular interest. This would be the set of the poor according to our normal analysis, and this would be the kind of age, if you want. The size of those sets is equal to the age, relative to the population. Now, because we use these sets in different ways, it's useful to give them names to denote them. And the idea is that we denote them according to the deprivations which overlap, which looks like this. So for instance, I hope you can see my pointer. In this set here, people are only deprived in indicator 1. And in this left set here, people are deprived only in 1 and 2, but not indicator 3. And in the middle one, the individuals here have deprivation in all 3 of the indicators. And this notation is useful to explain how we study the interlinkages. Now we can also say something about the size of those sets. So we denote just the size of each of the subsets is n, and then in the name of the set. If we sum up over all of these subsets here, which constitute poverty, we get the number of the poor people. And this relates obviously to the headcount ratio if we divide by the population number. Now, what is a deprivation profile? How can we study them? Well, a deprivation profile can be understood as any particular combination of the individual deprivation indicators. In the paper, we also have a formal treatment of that, but here we will do it intuitive and graphically. Now, let's take a look again at this Venn diagram, and we see we want to study, in some sense, every individual gray subset. Now, keep in mind, we have only 4 subsets here. In the global MPI case with 10 indicators, we would have over 900, which constitute poverty. So this is a much easier case to understand and analyze. It may sometimes even look very trivial, but in the empirical applied case, it is not. A natural way to study is to study the prevalence, which we can do like this. So essentially, we take the frequency and we focus here in the analysis on the profile prevalence among the poor. So we just divide by the number of poor in that society. And we have for each of the profiles here, we have a prevalence, so the relative frequency in percent, or as a proportion. So that's one way to study deprivation profiles. Now, bundles are a little bit differently defined. Here we focus on all deprivation profiles, so a set of profiles which feature a particular set of deprivation among other deprivations. For example, indicator 1 and 2, and we also include people who may or may not be deprived in indicator 3. So this would look like this. So bundles can be represented like this. We have again our simplified framework here. And now we can focus, for example, on the bundle of 1 and 2 deprived, which is the gray set here. And we can also compute the relative frequency of that, which is the sum of the set sizes of those two divided by the number of poor. So that's the prevalence of the deprivation 1-2 bundle among the multidimensionally poor. And then we can do the same thing for deprivation 1 and 3. So which is the rightmost column here in this bar chart. And we can finally also study the last bundle, which is bundle 2-3. Now, to put things in perspective, we only have 3 bundles here. If we study the global MPI, we have 45 bundles to study. And we can also go a step further. I just assumed we want to study a bundle, but actually we can study different quantities. We can study a singleton, which is a kind of special case, a single deprivation. And that actually tends to coincide to what the censored headcount ratio usually captures. But we could also study triplets or quadruples. So meaning the prevalence of a triplet would be like the joint deprivation in 3 specific indicators, whether or not other deprivations are present, which doesn't make much sense in this example, but in the global MPI it does. So this is like kind of one angle on the joint distribution, but we can also add more detail conditional on that angle, meaning we focus on bundles, but we look closer into how the profiles in that set of deprivation profiles looks like. And for that, we can use the co-deprivation rate. The idea is we calculate here a deprivation rate conditional on suffering from a particular deprivation bundle, which could be, for example, deprived in 1 and 2. In our empirical analysis, we also condition on the poverty status, which one can do, but it's not necessary. We could, of course, also study co-deprivations among the non-poor, among the vulnerable, for example. How do co-deprivations look like conceptually, and how do we compute them? Let's consider the co-deprivations of indicator 1. So this is a kind of singleton. bundle, if you want. So we want to know, for those who are poor and deprived in indicator 1, what are the co-deprivations? How do we proceed? So this is the set, the gray set is the one we condition on. And now we want to compute the co-deprivation in indicator 2, which is essentially the dark gray areas here relative to the light gray area. And this is exactly what we see here. It's the left-hand column of the bar graph. We sum up the prevalence of the two profiles and divide by the subset of all those profiles which imply deprivation in indicator 1. And we can do the same exercise for indicator 3, which would be this gray, dark gray area relative to the light gray. So that's a co-deprivation. So these are the key concepts with whom we will work. But we also use the latent class analysis. And what's the purpose of this analysis and how do we use it? This treatment will, or this explanation will also be intuitive. We again have a formal presentation in the appendix of the paper. But the idea is that a latent class analysis allows us to identify classes or classes of people or households which are similar to each other with respect to the probabilities with which they face particular deprivations. Now, in the way we use the latent class analysis, so in the relevant literature, one is referring to characteristics by which latent classes are defined, and we use only deprivation indicators as characteristics. So as a consequence, individuals with the same deprivation profile are assigned to the same class in the end, which means that effectively our analysis assigns deprivation profiles to a latent class, not only individuals. The entire profile goes into one class or the other. There are many benefits or like advantages of that kind of analysis. One of them is it allows for statistical errors in the prediction of deprivation probabilities. We won't cover that in detail. It's more about the conceptual relation that we are concerned with here. And what's the purpose of using that at all, in addition to what we already have? So the idea is to identify particular pertinent patterns in the data. So there are many ways to look at the joint distribution. This is one way, and it actually combines the different concepts that we used so far. And in a way, one can read that as a summary. This does not mean that this is the one and only way how the data can be interpreted. This is just trying to discover particular obvious patterns. And we see both our results showing up in the latent or reflected in the latent class analysis, and at the same time, new insights. So this is like the cautionary note, so heads up. First, we only focus on two classes just to illustrate how that approach looks like. And we also restrict the analysis to the multidimensionally poor. In reality, or in more applied or sophisticated work, one could explore different options. We will do that at some point, but we didn't do so for now. Like the number of classes could vary, obviously. And we use it as a preliminary device. It's preliminary results. And in particular, we use it as an exploratory device. Now, how can we make sense of latent class analysis in our framework? Now, let's consider an extreme case where the latent class assigns all the profiles to class 1, except a single profile, which is the light gray one here, which is 0, 1, 1. Only that one goes into class 2. How would the results in that case be reflected? How would this kind of partitioning of the population be reflected in latent class analysis? Well, first, we could calculate deprivation probabilities for each indicator conditional on class membership. Class membership would be here for class 1, the sum of the dark gray set sizes, and class 2 size is the light gray set size. And then for deprivation indicator 1, this is actually a special case, because all of the profiles which feature a deprivation in indicator 1 go into class 1. So if we calculate the probability here, this in the end amounts to 1, which is by definition, so to say, and holds here. On the other hand, nobody in class 2 is deprived in that indicator. For the other two deprivation indicators, it's a kind of intermediate case. So we see it's something between 0 and 1. We cannot say how much in this example, but we have here like deprivation probabilities. How can we, what kind of name tags can we assign to these deprivation probabilities? So the idea is in the literature on latent classes, there are dominant characteristics which is when they are close to 1. And in this case, we call that the dominant deprivation in that particular class. Which is, so it's a high probability within that class, then it's a dominant deprivation in that class. And the other deprivation rates here, we can interpret them as co-deprivation by what is described implicitly through the dominant deprivation. Now, there is one challenge to our previous concepts because it does not fully integrate. So we need a small extra concept. I will explain that briefly, which we call a profile package at this stage. So the idea is that we can select in a more customized way the different subsets into classes. The bundle, so it's an intermediate concept. The bundle is quite an encompassing concept because it covers the deprivation bundle for indicator 1 covers all 3 of the dark gray, and the pure profile angle is very detailed. And this, so it's like too nuclear, too granular. The idea is with a specific selection of deprivation profiles, we have an intermediate concept that allows to incorporate that. But I will. That's enough at this stage. Let's look a little bit at the empirical analysis. So this is a global analysis of the prevalence of deprivation profiles among the global poor. And we see, to start with, we have 20 profiles, the 20 most common profiles. And an interesting observation is already that these 20 profiles account for 35% of the poor, which is interesting because technically or empirically we observe over 800 profiles, but these are the most the 20 most common already account for more than a third of the multidimensionally poor. And what is not written here, but if we extend that to 50 profiles, this covers more than half of the global multidimensionally poor. Now, the description of what behind each of these prevalences is on the lower part of the figure, and we see whenever there is a dot, this means deprivation in that profile. For example, here the most common profile, which is highlighted which is shown on the most right, features deprivation in nutrition, in cooking fuel, in sanitation, and in housing. And this specific profile, this also means not a deprivation in any other of the indicators, only in exactly those. And this is the most common profile. We also see the second most common profile is the standard of living deprivation, meaning complete deprivation in all 6 living standard indicators. Now, if you imagine if we plot all of them, it's a very detailed view, and many of them have tiny quantities. So there is a challenge to kind of identify patterns, which is a drawback of this approach. On the other hand, it gives us an immediate sense of common profiles, but there is the real risk that we cannot see the forest for too many trees, or whatever. I think the phrase goes like that. We can also study deprivation profile prevalence by world region, and here we see the results for South Asia, and it's quite striking or obvious that we have very, very high deprivation in precisely the most common bundle and that we saw before. So nutrition, cooking fuel, sanitation, and housing deprivation. And this originates from India, if we look closer onto the national level. And again, here we see that the 20 most common profiles cover actually almost half of the multidimensionally poor in South Asia. And again, we see here another example, this time for sub-Saharan Africa. It's again, here we have the 20 most common profiles, which account for almost 50% of the multidimensional poor in sub-Saharan Africa. And if we look across the different profiles, we see living standard deprivation is a very common phenomenon here as well. But you see, the challenge is, I would see like the resolution in for this kind of analysis is very high. So we see lots of detail, and the idea is also to have in the framework tools which allow to have less resolution and different angles. And that is the analysis of bundles, which adds a different angle, which is complementing the full detail. So here we see the most common pairs and triplets. They are sorted by a prevalence on the world, on the global level. And the color dots around there are the world regions. I don't want to discuss too many of them in detail, But just to give you a sense of what we find is, the most common triplet, which is this one up here, it affects 60% of the global multidimensionally poor. And it means, the interpretation is that 60% of the global multidimensionally poor suffer from simultaneous deprivation in sanitation, housing, and cooking fuel, among other deprivations. So this is, there may or may not be additional deprivations here. And we also see, if we take a look at the dots here, the most right here is Sub-Saharan Africa, where it's very common. But we also see South Asia and the Arab states, which is dominated by Yemen population-wise, or South Sudan, is 50%. So that's on bundles. Now let me talk a little bit about co-deprivation. I know it's hard to read this figure, but still you have the full detail in the paper. But I want to direct your attention to, first I give you an introduction how to read it, and then I want to highlight two findings, more or less. On the left here, you see the gray bars show the prevalence of the bundle. So we are studying here only the most common bundle, right? So it's very prevalent around the world, in particular in some world regions. It's sanitation, housing, cooking fuel deprivation, simultaneous. And conditional on that, we want to know what are the co-deprivations of that particular bundle. And then we see, first, the gray bars show us the prevalence of that bundle among the poor. So how important is that for that bundle for the poor in a particular country? And then we also see, and that's the black, the black X here, this is the incidence, so the headcount ratio in that country. Just to make sure that we're not looking like, I mean, we see heterogeneity, you know, some countries which are shown have very low headcount ratios and others very high. It's something just to keep in mind. Now, the co-deprivations are ordered or structured here on the left are the health indicators, in the middle are the education indicators, and on the right are living standard indicators. And I want just a few observations. For example, you have here, India is here, pretty much in the center. And let's take a look at nutrition deprivation, nutrition co-deprivation in India, which is around 70%. And then you can compare this conditional on the triplet deprivation, right? Those who experience that triplet, 70% of those have also nutrition deprivation. This situation is quite different in Bangladesh, where the co-deprivation is less than 40%. So there is a pronounced contrast between those two. I mean, they differ in many respects, but in both countries, the triplet is of some relevance, and the co-deprivation varies in a very pronounced way. Now we see that variation in co-deprivation happens within world regions and across world regions. India is certainly not the only one with a high co-deprivation of that triplet in terms of nutrition. Yemen, for example, is up here, has a similar high co-deprivation rate. And there are also a couple of African countries, sub-Saharan African countries like Nigeria, Niger, Burundi, who have similar high deprivation rates. But this is by no means a general pattern, again, of sub-Saharan Africa, because we see also several countries with co-deprivation rates in nutrition below 0.4 or around 0.4. So that's one observation, the heterogeneity in that indicator. Another aspect is take a look at least at the most right panel on living standard. The black dots here, they indicate co-deprivation in electricity. And we see this seems to be, in the first place, a regional pattern, because the sub-Saharan countries, which are on the lower here, they all have very high co-deprivation rates. Actually, they're often close to 1. But again, this is not necessarily or exclusively a sub-Saharan African phenomenon, because we see those high co-deprivation rates also in Sudan, which is the first country here, in Papua New Guinea, and in Haiti, for instance. So this is not an exclusive phenomenon for sub-Saharan Africa, but we see, again, this across world regions. And we also see countries with relatively low co-deprivation rates in electricity, like Bangladesh is around 20%, for instance. This gives us a sense of heterogeneity in co-deprivation. Now, the next question is, this is a selected set of countries. can we generalize that somehow? How does that look on the global level? So, because this could be whatever we observe could be here due to the selection of the countries. Now let's aggregate these co-deprivation rates using population weights, and let's look at the full density distribution. So this is what you see on this figure. So you can interpret the area below the density plots can be interpreted as either normalized to 1, or it can be seen as the population of deprived in the triplet deprived, of those who are deprived in sanitation, housing, and cooking food simultaneously. We see some interesting observations here. One is that child mortality is a relatively rare event. There is also little spread. The black dot here is the mean on the global level, population weighted, and the black line is the interquartile range to get a sense for the distribution. So it's very pronounced, a relatively rare event, but we see also this hump here for child mortality. And now we could, if we wanted, go back to the country level data, and we see, for instance, child mortality is on the left, the black one. We see probably this is driven by countries like Nigeria, Niger, Burkina Faso, but also Bhutan, it seems. But then we can look at the other indicators as well. And maybe the most striking, one striking finding is the distributions of water and electricity, which are bimodal. So they have a very high spread, and we actually have humps on the far right and on the far left, which suggests that there is a driving forces behind. We did not explore that in detail, but the most likely candidates are, of course, the world region, but also the degree of or the share of rural and urban population. But that's something one could explore further. But then we also have more symmetric distributions, relatively speaking. Unimodal distributions, not really symmetric, but like for nutrition and education. An interesting observation is also that for some of the indicators, we don't see the values close to 1 or exactly 1 and 0. This is different, for example, for water and electricity, but it is less the case for nutrition. So we see relatively few observations in 0 and 1. Anyway, so yeah, that's just to give you a sense of how that can look like. Now let me come to the latent class analysis. I want to focus only on one particular aspect, how we can make sense and how that can complement our analysis. So we just focus on the world level. We ignore all the regional analysis. And we see here 2 classes. We assume 2 classes. We don't explore more. We can improve probably, quite sure. We also see the relative class size, meaning both classes are about making up approximately half of the global multidimensionally poor. And then we see how can we interpret. So what is shining through these coefficients, through these deprivation probabilities? Clearly, we see the importance of the most common triplet here, for example, even more so for latent class 2. So this is the sanitation, housing, cooking fuel deprivation, but we also see it in latent class 1. Latent class 1 actually has also very relatively high deprivation probability nutrition. And this is our result that we saw, which is the most common deprivation profile, which is obviously in many cases assigned or sorted into this class, or very likely in this class. Now, an interesting observation is that, for example, of course, I mean, we have the triplet. We identified also the triplet of the most common triplet, sanitation, housing, cooking fuel. But this analysis actually suggests on latent class 2, we have also relatively high deprivation probability of electricity. So one could argue that this analysis is suggesting maybe take a look at the quadruple with electricity. That seems to be a particular striking phenomenon here. And on the other hand, we see a strong contrast between these two, right? Between electricity, so and the 2 classes. The other coefficients here could be interpreted as the co-deprivation. So, and by the way, this nicely matches. I mean, this hump here matches exactly the analysis we had previously, because this is the right-hand hump of electricity that is showing up in latent class 2, essentially. This is showing up here. But we also see that 50% approximately of the members in class 2 suffer from deprivation in nutrition. So that's the co-deprivation interpretation. So in order to meet the time, let me continue to the discussion just to highlight some aspects why or how we can use this framework and how that can be informative for policy. So first is, why should we care about differences in bundle prevalence? One argument, I mean, we could, for example, look at the prevalence of a bundle 1 and 3. This is nothing we know from our usual results because we know not the specific overlap of 2 selected indicators among the poor. And for example, we can have different situations. For example, in one country, this could mean, I mean, the circles are meant to be same size and we can read them as censored headcount if you want, if we restrict that to the poor and deprived. And in one country, these deprivations essentially may overlap, and in the other one, they may barely overlap despite having similar headcount ratios, censored headcount ratios and censored headcount ratios. And so what can we use? How can we use that information? Well, one way is that using this intersection, we can actually identify the scale of a multi-sectoral program that is needed to address that. And at the same time, it allows us also to assess the synergy potential of a coordinated program, because instead of having 2 independent programs, which each target 1 deprivation, if there is sufficient overlap, we can also consider to have a joint program with a single targeting process or mechanism in order to gain or extract synergies. A second aspect is the co-deprivation. How and why does that matter? Let's consider the example of 2 countries, for instance, where we have co-deprivation in indicator 2 for the bundle deprivation 1 and 3. So the overlap between 1 and 3 is exactly the same, but in one case there is barely any overlap with deprivation 2, and in the other case there is huge overlap with deprivation 2. This is what the co-deprivation rates can tell us. We ignore the other deprivation of indicator 2 here. We focus on the conditional on being deprived in 1 and 3. And I think there are at least 2 reasons why that information or how that information can be used. One is, one can consider to increase effectiveness of a program, which means if you set up a program addressing 1 and 3 already anyway, you could look into the targeted group and see what is the most common deprivation in that group. And it could turn out in one country, it's indicator 2, and in another one, it is not. In some sense, so it's worth a consideration to target at the same time deprivation 2, while already having a program addressing 1 and 3. That's one way to use this information. Another way could also be, because additional deprivation can also make things more complicated. So we could think that, for example, a program that is supposed to bring children into school and addresses some other deprivation at the same time. This program may work in one country well, but may depend on the educational achievements of the parents, which are given in one country. But if there is deprivation in household education in another country, that may actually require to design an entirely different program. And you can think of other examples, for instance, where we saw the heterogeneity in co-deprivations, like nutrition or electricity. We saw in many countries, electricity, you can be sure that electricity is a common co-deprivation, while in others it is not. And depending on whether there is electricity in the household, you may have to revise the program in the first place. So these are 2 cases how this information could be used. Now, some reflections on the use of this kind of framework. I think the point became clear, but this allows a massive empirical analysis. And if you don't have any kind of guidance, I would say one is lost. You can study, in this case, over 1,000 profiles in a 10 indicator MPI. Well, the exact number depends on the K and other factors, but we have 1,000 profiles to study, and it's easy to get lost. If we focus on bundle analysis, we still have 45 pairs in the case of the global MPI, 120 triplets. And now recall, I just gave you a first angle on how to get a more nuanced analysis conditional on one particular triplet, right? And that was just one possibility out of those many. For each of the triplets and for each of the pairs, we can study 8 or 7 co-deprivations. That's a huge amount of analysis. And then we can study that on the global level, on the level of the world regions, on the national level, on the subnational level. So there are many, many angles from which the joint distribution could be studied here. And this is why one of the points we are making is that the objective is essential for any such analysis. And it helps to identify both. There are two aspects: the angle. So are you interested more in bundles and profiles, or of which indicators actually? Do you have a particular interest, for example, coming from the WASH program in sanitation and drinking water access? That is the angle. But also, that's one aspect where the objective can guide, and the other is the resolution. So how much detail do you need? How much detail do you want? Do you want to just assess the synergy potential? Or do you want to know all the co-deprivations on the different level of analysis, global, national, subnational? And that matters a lot for the analysis. Yeah, and I mean, there are many examples of potential objectives. One is it's assessing the potential synergies of a coordinated WASH program. One could be which other deprivations to include in an already existing coordinated program. Yet another could be to identify the need for adapting a particular successful program in one country to another country. Another aspect that is obviously also helpful is rely on effective or make use of effective data visualization. That can also help a lot, potentially interactive. But again, it's like there are many, many possibilities. So the objective is also key. And then we would also like to emphasize the justification for the analysis, which kind of follows from the objective. We did in this analysis, we were illustrating what can be done, and it's also empirically relevant what we found. And we were mostly, I mean, one intuition was we were motivated by prevalence. So what is most common among global, world region levels and so on. There can be different lines of motivation. One of them is detailed in the paper, but we don't cover it here in the presentation. It's severity. For instance, child mortality, we saw it's a relatively rare co-deprivation, and in general, we know that deprivation rates, censored or uncensored, are relatively small. But in this case, we can look actually at another concept which Sabina James proposed in a different paper, which is the censored intensity, which is the deprivation among the poor and in a particular dimension deprived households. And that is actually higher for those who are deprived in child mortality. So you can make the case that these are much more severe interlinkages to be addressed, even though they're not the most prevalent. If you would only focus on prevalence, you would overlook this kind of finding. And again, it can also be, it doesn't have to be like purely empirically driven, like prevalence or severity or so. It could also be just political priorities. So if there is a UN agency particularly interested in the WASH program, then it would be these indicators to look into. And then depending on the objective, study co-deprivation or bundles or what else. Okay, the time is up. Let me just give me 1 or 2 remarks. Well, maybe I can stop here, but one thing I should mention is a disclaimer. Well, the obvious limitation of this study is that it's mostly relying on pre-COVID data, which means, I mean, we expect setbacks for multidimensional poverty in general, but also these setbacks can be expected to affect indicators unevenly. So given the school closures and given the current deepening nutrition crisis, one could expect things or increases in profiles, bundles, or in deprivations in nutrition and school attendance in particular. But that's something to keep in mind in terms of the empirical findings. Then now I'm happy to hear your comments and questions, and also to what Ricardo will answer.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Nicolai, for a very well-structured and comprehensive presentation, extremely insightful, and of course very relevant in time, especially the age of the SDGs and tracking and leveraging interlinkages between SDG indicators, of which the global MPI indicators are, of course, also prominent representatives. I see that our co-host James Foster already very impatiently raised his hand to get us going with the discussion. I think Davina also had a question earlier. Perhaps we can allow Davina also to unmute and ask a question directly, if that's possible for colleagues in Washington. And then, of course, whilst you all still have another minute to digest, we can also take questions and comments here from the audience in the room. So, James, please.
Well, I feel like I've jumped in after Davina. If she wants to, actually, I'll just jump in and make one observation based on what it was that was said toward the end. It seems to me that the real excitement here, I mean, there's real excitement in lots of things because it is a much more understandable, concrete analysis at the end of the day. The problem is, of course, it's many, many, many dimensions, and the dimensions drive you crazy. But it makes for a really interesting look at dynamics. So let's understand what's happening at the big picture. It is, we've taken a lot of data and passed it through the lens of a measurement approach. And that measurement approach gives you an answer for each observation. Is this person poor or not? And at the end of the day, we get the overall MPI to evaluate how much poverty there is. And if we stop there, we don't get too far, in a sense. It's nice, we have an understanding of how much poverty there is, but really to attack poverty, you have to have much more nuance. You have to understand where that poverty came from, the provenance of the poverty. And that's what this analysis is providing. Why, goodness, much of it is located in this type of a configuration of deprivations. So I think that whole way of looking at things is the right way, and it's particularly right for trying to attack poverty. And so I wanted to ask one question. Have you thought about, you mentioned COVID toward the end, we are going to see over the next 4 or 5 years when data comes out that global MPI will increase in many, many areas, many, many parts of the world, of course, across most of the world, in fact. So the question is, could you apply your analysis in an effective way to understand where the retrenchment of poverty now has come in, and what might be done, or how guidance might be put in place to actually reverse it? So I'm just wondering if you've thought through that.
Maybe I can just quickly reflect on what James just said, Nicolai. Yeah. So thank you very much. So indeed, the purpose of this work is to kind of shed a first light on not only the complexity, but also the possibilities of analysis that can arise when you look at data from this angle. And I think that having a difference between, for example, what a profile and a bundle, or for example, a profile package is already something that has to be taken forward. And as you correctly say, James, I think that staying only at describing a picture of what data looks like at one point in time is, of course, one way to start, but it's certainly not perhaps the last or the most useful. I think that the intention of this is to go forward and see how those interlinkages actually break up in some regions, and why, and to what extent, or if new interlinkages emerge from the existing ones. So I think that, if this becomes a subsequent analysis and a regular analysis through the lens of global MPI data, you can see how those interlinkages are reinforced or broken over time. Our hypothesis is that, for example, in the case of COVID, we already have some kind of idea about new deprivations in certain indicators arising. But the question arises as to what are those new deprivations are going to be coupled with. And depending on that answer, I think that the policy response needs to be different, right? So just making a sense of that and not losing yourself in the wealth of data, as Nicolai was explaining, is, of course, one first way that we want to put forth in this paper. Now, as Nicolai just mentioned, we offer 2 ways of doing that. So the first is, of course, a very precise way while defining very strict conditionality. So, for example, being deprived in a certain bundle or a certain indicator, what are the co-deprivations that you're likely to face? But we know that data is not necessarily that ordered, right? We have some kind of disorder, we have some kind of errors in the data. So what we're trying to vividly explore, and Nicolai just mentioned that at the very end, is to see whether some statistical tools where errors of prediction in terms of what's the likelihood of being deprived, for example, in one particular aspect of the global MPI, are also something that is very much on the agenda. So your point is very well taken, James, because we think that this is just the first step in an analysis that from a policy lens needs to be more thought out and more carried on in depth.
Nicolai, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I agree with what Ricardo just said, and I think it's also an important point James raised. I mean, the challenge is, as Ricardo mentioned, I think that, I mean, what we can observe in 2 years of data, or with 2 rounds of survey, we could kind of see the different profiles and could compare what happened. One thing that we don't know, because it's repeated cross-section, is whether there were transitions from one profile to another. That's something we cannot know, at least not with this, with our usual data. If we had panel data, that could be studied, but we don't. So that's certainly a challenge, and we have to think about how to address that. But still, a comparison can be, I mean, it's not maybe trivial to do that kind of comparison, but still, it's something to look into if it's available. And of course, I mean, what is also looming is that potentially one could consider to combine this with simulation techniques to see something. But that's like, I mean, ideally, on the methodological side, some work with panel data would be nice as well, but even though that cannot be applied on a large scale.
Right. Thanks, Nicolai and Ricardo. I keep getting the names wrong today. Any other questions online or from anyone here in the room?
Davina?
I think Davina said she accidentally raised her hand, so we'll excuse her on this occasion.
Sorry, I have a bunch actually. I have a couple of things that I'd like to.
Hey, James, can you wait 1 second, and then we have Heriberto from UNDP first, and then you can
Fantastic.
ask James.
First, I want to congratulate the authors, Nicolai, Ricardo here, because I think this is really, for us, it's a breakthrough. Because allows us to understand better the policy angle. So, and I wanted to ask you more about that. So, could you go back to the main potential that we have to analyze policies, and based on your analysis, what are the key elements that we are already learning from the perspective of policy? So why is it the case that some bundles are, let's say, more resilient or more prevalent in certain places, and what is behind that? Do you have any early results to show us about that?
Hi, Heri. On the reason of prevalence, you mean?
Yeah, so whether there are some patterns, let's say, so why is it the case that in certain places certain combinations are more prevalent than in other places, and whether there is already certain connection with policies, so we can, in other words, to what extent we can use this apparatus to assess the effectiveness of policies. And how they do it, because here we can see also the mechanism of transmission and how a policy, for instance, can address more than one deprivation at a time.
Yeah. So I can answer partly the question, and perhaps Nicolai and Sabina, who's also in the room, may have some reflections as well. So when it comes to the policy uses, I do think that if you actually match up the results that we have with kind of pre-existing programs, like, for example, housing programs in some regions in South Africa and sub-Saharan Africa, then you do realize that some aspects, for example, of those programs are actually being tackled, and they should be, because those deprivations come together. What is, I think, new in the analysis that we provide is what co-deprivations come along those. So, for example, you do have a housing program where you focus on sanitation, where you focus on access to water, but, for example, you don't detect the need for electricity as being part, for example, of that particular bundle. So in those cases, improving or lifting people out of those deprivations would require some kind of complementary interventions or complementary programs, if you want, kind of coupled with a core one. And the richness of this, and of course, we didn't have any time to actually discuss that now, and it's not so prominently presented perhaps in the paper, is that since this builds on the AF method, this can actually be decomposed and disaggregated by subnational levels. So Nicolai just mentioned that, you know, we can have, we have a regional analysis as we have presented it. We can go through a country analysis as we have shown, but actually can go even deeper. So subnational analyses are very, very useful in this case, even through the lens of global MPI, to see whether those programs need some kind of complementary actions, but in a different way within countries. So I guess that, as you say, Eddie, the scope for analysis and the scope to actually revise perhaps region-wise complementary policies around, say, core housing programs in sub-Saharan Africa, I'm not saying that they should be only informed through this lens, but they can certainly benefit from having the information of what is the extent of people suffering from these co-deprivations, you know, that are kind of, you know, very common among the beneficiaries of the program. So that's my first take. I don't know, Nicolai and Sabina perhaps have some complementary answers.
Yeah, maybe one thing to add. I mean, I agree that that's definitely one way to read the results. I mean, and to use them, I think, which is relevant for informing policy. But another way which we did not explore for now is, I mean, for now we are just kind of playing with a framework, with the methodological apparatus, if you want, and to see how things are looking like, to better understand how to identify the patterns, how to describe the patterns best. And we're still at that stage, I would say. One way, which is, I'm not sure whether that can work, is, but in principle, latent class analysis, for example, could be used to describe in a more specific way which latent classes or profile packages occur where. So this means with the bundle analysis, we can do it to some extent, and also, but the idea is with latent classes, for instance, we could look into things like landlockedness or like infrastructure with harbors or I mean climate potentially. These could be factors to see that could also help to illuminate the why. I mean, this is going a step towards conventional regression analysis type of approach. But of course, I mean, whether this works in our case, we will see. I mean, this involves a couple of assumptions, but that could be one way to kind of better understand why and where we observe specific patterns. I mean, I'm using not patterns because not only the bundle aspect and not only the profile aspect, something in between. So it's like, yeah. So I think that could be used. I mean, we didn't go into this direction for now. We just try to, at this stage, we kind of stopped at incorporating the latent class analysis into our existing concepts, because one of the limitations of the analysis often raised in the literature is that you cannot properly interpret the classes. And I think this is something we can do with our concepts. But that's one avenue we can explore, I mean, among others.
Thanks. I think Sabina also had a brief comment, and then we have at least 2 questions here in the room after that, which we might take before James gets another chance getting rid of his questions. So first Sabina, and then the questions.
Yeah, I'll be brief, Harry. If you think of just water and sanitation, if you think of UNICEF or UN programs, they would look at the crosstab of the data. And what the global MPI does is it identifies the poor. And so we already know in the censored headcount ratios, the drinking water prevalence among the poor, the percentage of people who are poor and deprived in drinking water is lower in South Asia. And the percentage of people who are poor and deprived in electricity is higher in sub-Saharan Africa. So in that sense, across regions, the censored headcount already captures new information that looks at the joint distribution of these 10 indicators. What does this add? I think 2 things, potentially. One is consider 2 states where they have the exact same censored headcount ratios, the exact same contribution of indicators to poverty. In one, it might be the case that everybody has similar deprivation profiles. In another, it might be that there are 2 climactic zones or rural and urban area, and that there are 2 or indeed more common profiles that make up the exact same overall. We don't know yet if that will be possible to uncover, but that I think would be really exciting for policy, because it would, right now what countries are doing is using the censored headcount ratios, the percent contributions for budget allocation and for policies. If we say that actually that is good enough, then that would be good enough. But until we do this work on profiles, we actually don't know. And so this will really be able to sharpen very greatly some of the policies that are actually now already being used. The second, very briefly, is just to say that in terms of bundles and profiles, we have to bear in mind if poverty is not so common and a country has hundreds of profiles, you're pushing your sample size. And so deprivation bundles with standard errors are going to probably be the way to go, because profiles are probably going to have ginormous confidence intervals. So I think really working with the bundles is a good step forward until we really understand and figure out how to deal with some of these sample size issues.
Actually, I can just add directly to that. For the co-deprivation rates, we computed already standard errors, and it makes a difference in some countries, of course. I mean, suddenly you see the confidence intervals over there covering the entire domain. So because it's only like a handful of observations, but for many of the countries, we see that this can be used in a meaningful way and in a reliable way because sample sizes are sufficient. But yeah, so I'm saying it's definitely a real issue to take that into account.
Yeah, great question, Harry. Thank you, Ricardo, Nicolai, and Sabina for the answers. Now, Kellyanne first, then yourself, and you also had a question. So we have 3 questions in the room. Maybe we can take them all together, if that's all right with the presenters, in the interest of time. Okay, so in this order.
Okay. Hi, my question is quite simple, and it's for all the researchers. And I'm asking, based on the analysis, is it possible to know if certain bundles reinforce others or reinforce certain co-deprivations? Like, can we say that concretely as researchers, or are we more looking at associations where you cannot say that one causes the other? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. It makes, like, having listened to the overall MPI last week, now it makes it more clear on what empirically can be done with it. Like that's really amazing, and I like the framework you essentially developed and now want to use. So in the same vein, I have a question on the sense that, one, politically, could you use that also as sort of as an at-risk definition on, like, seeing the prevalence of sort of this co-deprivation, and then seeing, okay, which are the people that are, where are there specific risks of getting more deprived in which areas this, and then maybe pushing that framework further when you say you can know where those specific problems are. Would you also be able to know when, like in sort of a sequential manner, how, like, which deprivation precedes the other one, and how does that, how does time play into it, or could it essentially at some point play into it?
I guess my question is a bit similar in sort of those two that were just asked, but maybe from a different angle of, like, could this be used to show over time if certain strengths can provide a protective effect, or like a resilience to shocks or different vulnerabilities?
Yeah, it's really fantastic, and all somewhat related questions, I think. Nicolai and Ricardo.
Yeah, maybe I can kickstart with quick reflections. And what I gather from the 3 questions is that we must go into dynamic analysis, and that's kind of the ask that we're doing. So for the first question, no, for the time being, it's only associations. We cannot infer any kind of causality, or we cannot assess whether we have drivers among the deprivations yet. That avenue will arise when we see some kind of dynamics or temporal we have a pre, how do you say that? So if we have a before and after, or we have something that precedes temporally the existence of one deprivation as opposed to another. And what we can do for sure is to try to see whether we can detect particularly vulnerable populations to certain shocks. So for example, once we pinpoint to what extent and where we have a certain bundle, for example, manifesting, then we can assess whether, for example, some kind of climate shock, or even security shock, like for example, war or civil conflict, may actually put some people at risk of becoming even poorer if we focus on the poor in the first place. So we can not only identify those, but we can see to what extent the ignition or the existence of that shock can actually trigger some situations, and we can perform some kind of simulations, for example. That ties into the third question, where you can ex ante, for example, have an idea of what the consequence would be of the existence of a certain shock once you have identified the particularly vulnerable population based on what is the combination of deprivations that they already face. So, for example, just as an example, if we think of the COVID case, if we had this analysis previously, then the idea would be to see whether people who don't have electricity, who don't have certain assets, or who don't have educated parents at home, perhaps you can think of these people as being particularly deprived, or children living in those households as being particularly prone to perhaps having a disruption in the education process due to COVID, if school closes, for example. So you can detect those people in the first place, and you can see to what extent that vulnerability may manifest to inform policy ex ante. So those are very good avenues for research. I think for the time being, they're not present in the paper, but they're very good suggestions going forward.
Nicolai, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, maybe just quickly to all of them where they refer to time. I mean, of course, it would be nice. I mean, a natural way to study that would be, again, using panel data where we can study transitions. What has really been there before and what not. I mean, if we would work with repeated cross sections, I mean, there are avenues, but they usually require assumptions and how to. I mean, for instance, there are pseudo panels, but they can be strong in their assumption. But of course, if there is panel data, these things can be studied. And I mean, I did something not with the global MPI, but with EOSILK panel data, for instance, and you can find patterns that the presence of multiple deprivation increases the probability to experience a new deprivation compared to a non-poor, non-deprived person. So there are patterns like that, but in order to really document them, panel data is, of course, makes life much easier. But still, it's definitely something. I mean, it's not explicitly incorporated at the moment, but it's something that is more or less, it's on our mind, I would say.
If that, for example, in the simulations of food insecurity or an increase in undernutrition were applied to people who were poor or vulnerable, but not at that time deprived in undernutrition. Now, with ex post data, we could see if 50 million people become undernourished in a country, what proportion of those fell on people who were already poor or who are in the second wave, poor or vulnerable. So in a sense, it can help us in a very, very rough cross-sectional way validate that. Or similarly, if one deprivation leaves, usually with another one in tow, what does that show? So I think it's messier than panel data, but I think it would just be fun to paw through and see what we happen to find.
Great. Any other questions here in the room or online? That does not seem to be the case. James, did you have an urgent question?
Well, not urgent at all, but I just want to comment that we've been talking about the many angles of poverty here, and that's the name of the series. This is, in some sense, the very essence of what the technology was meant to do. Interestingly, at the beginning of the discussions of multidimensional poverty, there was a critique that said, well, how would you consider going to a doctor who used one index to understand your problems? And this analysis itself is showing us how to use this one index appropriately. That is, go back into the structure that created that index. You're going into things in ways that really do help understand what's actually going on and leading us to the level of poverty that we've seen. Really get down and deep in understanding it. Now, I do want to make one small suggestion. That is, once you get into subsets and power sets and infinity of potentiality, it often is useful to let machines do the learning as to what's really going on. So I would probably argue that at this point, it's one of the few cases where I would suggest it. I rarely suggest it otherwise. It's a case where we might actually have a sense of the applicability of machine learning or other types of tools to discern out. Say a question is the following. Suppose that we are looking at our original deprivation singleton-wise, and then we say, now, suppose we had only a finite number of programs that a country could develop, say 5, would they be singleton focused, or would they be pair focused, or would they be triplet focused? And can we let perhaps the data help us in discerning where our focus, what our priorities should be? So that's just my comment and a question that's kind of open to you all. And thanks a lot for your presentation.
Thank you, James. Any quick reactions, Ricardo, Nicolai, or Sabina?
Just very quickly for me, thank you very much for listening to us, and all the comments and feedback and questions are very well taken. So this is just scratching the surface, and by all means we do intend to work on the directions that you pointed us to, because I think it's relevant. I think we have been using this data in a very useful way, but there's more to that, and looking at how we can use these interlinkages to uncover even more power within the data that we already have at hand, and that can be to a certain extent put into a dynamic context, is something that I think it's a very valuable avenue for research. So yeah, we definitely tend to go that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ricardo. I see a raised hand from the Elliott School of International Affairs.
Hi, that's me. I was just wondering if you had taken any of this data and looked at any specific external or unexpected shocks, to look to see how the data might change over time in reaction to something like a food crisis or a conflict or a natural disaster, to see if you can also, moving forward, better predict what deprivations move in tandem or move jointly across space and time, and help you use that to better allocate resources, whether from the international aid community or from individual governments or even local municipalities. And then maybe as a further add-on to that, can you try to build that into the planned spending, the resilience building, the adaptation of best practices to future challenges, which we don't know when they will happen, but we know will happen. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kyle. So just a very quick reaction. The answer is we did the only preliminary analysis that we did in that sense was with the COVID pandemic, where we didn't apply these interlinkages as much as we could perhaps in a revision of that concept, but we did try to foresee the extent to which, you know, this kind of shock, a very particular shock, would affect people's lives. But then again, thinking about that, we are actually thinking about extending and refining that simulation process, where we can have different risks of damage basically done to different households in different regions, even if they're exposed to the same risk. So basically, we're trying to develop a program, because the question that you pose is very pertinent, but the answer is of course not straightforward. It's very context dependent. And it comes not only with the possibility for it to be taken up from the policy angle, but also from the technicality that you have by dealing with not a register of beneficiaries, for example, or a census, but sample data. So there is some technicality that needs to go into answering that question properly. And yes, so basically we will extend that COVID analysis that we did to refine the risk of deprivations arising, and to have a better understanding of how heterogeneous that risk and those effects are across not only countries, but also regions within countries, data permitting. So yeah, you've kind of pinpointed our next step when it comes to research from that angle. Thank you, Kyle.
In that case, we'll wrap up at this point. Please join me in giving a warm round of applause to our thank you, Nicolai and Ricardo, and also thanks to all co-hosts, for James and Kyle and Natalie and the team in Washington, and everyone at UNDP, as well as to Kellyanne and all our other colleagues at OPHI who make the seminar series possible. Thank you all for taking the time to joining us here in the seminar room and on Zoom. And we'll be back next week with a special spooky Halloween session. Who would be better as a presenter for that than our very own James Foster, who's going to present on, well, you see how spooky it is, on unidimensional underpinnings of multidimensional counting measures. And I think, James, you might be on this side of the pond for that next week, or are you going to join us remotely?
Still determining, but the prices are pretty high, so I might wind up staying here. Who knows? Let's flip a coin.
Then it goes from the distance next week for that presentation. So thank you all for joining us, and please feel free to check out the working paper or research in progress paper that Nicolai and Ricardo presented, which is online on our website, as well as the global MPI report online on our website and HJO's website, where all of this is very well documented and not to explore in writing there.